wouldn't remember otherwise. So yeah, good. Any other comments or questions before we get into it? Because this week's text is so good, that, and I warned you last week that we likely were going to get into some really interesting stuff regarding transgender views towards Judaism. Very tangentially, obviously, because we're in Rosh Hashanah. But we also, the other warning that I'm giving you all is that we may not get to it this week. It may have to wait till next week because I can never figure out how much material we're going to cover in a week. In general, I try and cover like a good chunk, like about a quarter of a page, and assume there's no way we'll get through all of this. And occasionally you all surprise me, and we move very quickly. And occasion, but that's very rare. And normally we move deliberately, which is what I prefer. I would rather everybody have their say and everybody get to kind of cogitate on things, and that we digress onto issues of the day. D says that D has to leave early. All right, great. If you're picking up donuts,
I have to leave very much on time because I'm going out later, but I will be here till we finish.
Good.
And I will
so anyways, in the end, if I, oh yeah, it was Grogu. Thank you, Olivia. Yeah, this is the mug is we got this for my son. It says, what does it say? Snack, attack, protect. It's a cute one. It's a good mug. He never used it. All right. Anyways, let's go on. We'll do some Talmud. If you are scoring at home, for those of you who would like to either study the page on their own or have it on a separate screen in the event that it gets too confusing, we are going to start off at the very bottom of page 28b, which is in Sefaria. I use the Sefaria reference points because it makes it really easy for all of us. I've just put the link into the chat. It's 28b line 25. And in Steinsaltz, it's page 124, although none of you are probably using that. So the reason I started there is because, let's get out of this, is because it sets up an important thing. So as we last left off, so Mark, there will be some confusion for you because you're catching up at the very end of a parak of Talmud, which is fine. Jumping into any section of Talmud is the assumption that you would jump into the beginning of a tractate of Talmud or the beginning of a Mishnah, and it would make more sense than jumping in at any random point. Right, Renee's shaking her head like that's not true. It's all difficult. All of it's tangential. None of it makes any sense. It's no different than logging on to Facebook every 6 months. You didn't miss anything, right? There's a new, somebody's trip to Hawaii and somebody so-and-so passed away and somebody else said something inflammatory politically and somebody else had a cute hat. I mean, like, it's like there's no linear story to this, and that's how Talmud is. There are some linear pieces, but very briefly for Mark and for anybody else who hasn't been in a while or who doesn't remember the general thing, we're really focused on the issues around a shofar and how shofars discharge obligations, right? That has to do with both the shofar, where it is heard, whether the person has intent for hearing it, and at the very beginning of this paragraph, we were dealing with the kosher status of a shofar, right? Which asks the questions like if it was plated in silver, if it had a crack in it, right? If it was too short, if it was too long, would it be kosher? Would it be fitting? Would the sound discharge your obligation? And then the question becomes, well, if it has a crack in it, why would that fail to discharge your obligation? And the essential nature of what they decided was there's an essential quality to the sound of a shofar that must emanate from an unbroken shofar. And once you crack it, it changes the sound. So suddenly we get into this fascinating dialogue, one of the more interesting sections of all of Talmud, by the way, of like, what is the sound? What is the essential quality of the sound of a shofar? And what happens if it's modified? And what qualifies as modifying the essential sound of a shofar? Which gets into a theological issue of, is a broken shofar still a shofar, right? And I think that would make for a really good high holiday sermon for me or for Marion. Marion, if you want to come to Erie and give my high holiday sermon, that'd be great. They wouldn't appreciate it because they're paying me, but they might appreciate it because you'd probably do a great job. So, but the question being like, if you modify the essential sound of something, is it still itself, right? If I sing in a low, right? If I have potentially the like 4-octave range, or I can fake 4-octave range, right? If I can pretend to sing in a falsetto, right? Am I singing? Or am I singing falsetto, right? And if I'm singing especially low, is that not my natural singing voice? So, what is me, and what is me attempting to modify myself into something that is not me? That's the beginning part. The part that we're going to jump in on is really the question of discharging one's obligation and having intent. And we've been stuck on intent for about a half a page or maybe a whole page, which is a long time. And the question of, can I have intent for something if I'm just grabbing a shofar off the shelf and blowing it to see if I can get a sound out of it, right? Like, one of the first things I do at the beginning of shofar season every year is remind myself that you don't just go to blow a shofar. You go, right? You're spitting, your lips are making a tight seal, and you're doing this little thing. So the first thing I ever do when I grab a shofar is see if I can blow it and remember to how to get the umbrature proper. Does that discharge someone's obligation for hearing shofar and the like? All right, with that, let's get going. Marion, why don't you read line 25 and line 1 for us in the English? I will do the Aramaic. Amar le Rabbi Zera le Sham'e. Ichaven utakali. Alma kasaver mashmia by kavana. Go ahead, Marion.
With regard to the intent required in order to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar, Rabbi Zera said to his servant, have intent to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. The Gemara infers, apparently, Rabbi Zera maintains that he who sounds the shofar for others is required to have intent to discharge the hearer's obligation.
Okay. So this is one of those little intent moments. I think we read this last week, but blew right by it because we were doing other things and we were stuck in some of the other logic. But it's really interesting. So Rabbi Zera is one of these important rabbis, and he's one of our two big rabbis. So going back a couple pages, Rava and Rabbi Zera have a big disagreement that's been running for pages. Rava is the one who says ein mitzvot tzrichot kavana, and Rabbi Zera says mitzvot tzrichot kavana. To translate, Rava says mitzvot don't require intent, meaning if I'm grabbing my tefillin just to make sure that the straps are long enough, and I just grab them like, oh, I wonder if my arm strap is long enough. And I wrap it on my arm, and I'm like, oh yeah, what's the blessing here? I forget. Oh, it's Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. I'm done, right? I fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin and Shema because I put them on and I said it, right? I don't have to think very seriously that I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin, right? Like, I said that in a very like Chabad emissary kind of way intentionally, right? Like, you gotta have kavanah for the thing. Rabbi Zera holds mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. You are required to fulfill a mitzvah. You must have focus, intent, direction for the thing. The problem that Rava brought up a while ago is you have the potential for people like Rabbi Goodman, who has ADD and shows up at evening minyan and is kind of like focused on packing the kids' lunches for tomorrow and whether the garage door is open. I don't have a garage, but if I had a garage, the garage door being open, then it's possible if I don't have kavanah for evening prayer and I have ADD and I'm always like this at evening prayer, then in my whole life, I never said Ma'ariv properly. Not once, right? I never fulfilled the mitzvah. And these are the competing schools of thought that we have here. So here we have Rabbi Zera saying to his servant, and this is the interesting thing as a lead-in to giving someone else kavanah, right? Making someone else hold the thing. He says to his servant, have kavanah and sound the shofar for me, right? Which is really interesting. So this idea that like, if I hold the shofar and I say, I am going to fulfill the mitzvah for everyone and I'm going to blow the shofar, you will all hear it. And because I have kavanah, I'm discharging your obligation on Rosh Hashanah for blowing shofar. right? I can declare all that, and then I can focus and I can blow, right? If the question is, can I hand my shofar to Marion and say, Marion, blow this shofar with the intent to discharge everybody's obligation for the holiday? How can I
Definitely
create
not.
intent for another human being? Okay, Mark, ask your question, and then we'll go.
Yeah, I just want to throw a monkey wrench into the whole issue. The servant, is the servant Jewish, or is the servant perhaps Canaanite or Gentile in general? And that raises the question: can a Catholic blow the shofar and make me fulfill the obligation?
Good. So, by the way, Olivia's really good at emojis. Olivia threw up a literal monkey wrench as a symbol on their thing.
That is so
good job,
cool.
Olivia. Two things. One, I say this occasionally, but it's been a while since I said it. So when I learned before I became a conservative Jew, I was a very confused Reform Jew. And I went kind of like non-movemental for a while. And for a couple of years, I was kind of floating in Orthodox circles without being Orthodox. And I wound up for a summer at Aish Torah in Jerusalem, which is the flagship of Aish Torah. But I did a really cool thing, which was rather than take all of Aish Torah's classes, Aish is a kiruv yeshiva. They take kind of non-observant, unknowledgeable Jews and flip them to a very firebrandy version of fundamentalist orthodoxy, which is very based in kind of philological tricks and theological shortcuts. If I were to be not quite politically correct, although if I had an Aish Torah rabbi in front of me and he definitely heard that I said that it was theological shortcuts, we would have it out and I would whoop his ass. So anyways, I think I would whoop his ass. If I didn't whoop his ass, I would be upset with myself. When I was there, I skipped most of the Aish classes because I knew they were garbage. And their Beit Midrash was open to, in Jerusalem and in most of the yeshivot in Israel, there are two time periods called Bein Zman. One's called Bein Zman, which is summer break. And there are two other large breaks. There's a winter break and a Sukkot break and a Pesach break. Three other large breaks where the students who they either go traveling or they go home. And in the summer, all the yeshivas are basically closed. And so what happened is the students who were at yeshiva from other yeshivot would come to Aish Torah and they would learn in the Beit Midrash all day. So what we wound up with was the all-star team of yeshiva students. So I wound up learning halakha with some guys from the Mir, and I learned Gemara from some guys from Midrash Shmuel, and I had another class. I had a Parsha class with some folks from like Har Etzion, right? Like some of the big yeshivot in town, which is great. And so I was learning a section of Talmud with one of these yeshiva bochers, and I said something like what Mark said, which was I said something that was an objection or a thought, and he like gave me a high five. I was like, what? And he said, you anticipated Shiloh that the Gemara is going to ask about a half a page from now, right? And it was a really good feeling. And so, Mark, I'm giving you a digital high five because this is actually where the next Mishnah is going to go, which is Rabbi Zera has said to his servants, go discharge the obligation. The Gemara's obvious next logical problem is, whoa, who can discharge his obligation for other people? And they'll go down a laundry list. And then, of course, because it's the Talmud, they're not just going to list it and go away. They're going to debate every single person on the list and ask the question, does this person legitimately have the ability to discharge other people's obligations? So well done. So that's one important thing, which is the assumption typically, for just to actually start to answer Mark's question a little bit, is the assumption is Rabbi Zera's servant is Jewish. The problem becomes if they are, whether they are kind of a paid servant or whether they're an indentured slave. Slaves and half slaves in Israel often have lesser halachic status for obvious reasons, which is they don't have free will, right? A slave can't do free will. They have to do the will of their master. And therefore, that means that the ability to kind of let someone do something of their own will and accord that discharges someone else's obligation is problematic, right? It creates a difficulty. So interesting. So we're already into the category of whether one human being can direct someone else to discharge the obligation for other human beings. All right, with that, we're going to go to Paula. You're going to do number 2. 2 is a metiv, or as I was taught and when I originally learned this, a meisve. A meisve is a specific kind of objection. A meisve, to metiv something in Aramaic is to throw it up, right? To chuck it. And the only things you chuck in halachic language are a logical proof from either Torah, or really a meisve is almost always a baraita. We're going to throw a baraita at this thing, a monkey wrench, as Olivia might say, or as Mark might say. We're going to throw an objection here, which is a piece of legalese, which befuddles and confuses the last thing we said. All right, I'll do the Aramaic. Paula, you're going to do the English. Meitve. Haya over achorai beit haKnesset, o shehaya beito samuch lebeit haKnesset, veshama kol shofar or kol megillah, im kiven libo yatsa, ve'im lav lo yatsa, vechi chiven libo mai have, he'ach lo ka mikaven adata dide. Go ahead, Paula.
The Gemara raises an objection from the Mishnah. If one was passing behind a synagogue or his house was adjacent to the synagogue and he heard the sound of the shofar or the sound of the scroll of Esther being read, if he focused his heart to fulfill his obligation, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. It may be asked, and according to Rabbi Zera, if the hearer focused his heart, what of it? The other one, i.e., the one sounding the shofar, did not focus his intent to sound the shofar with him in mind. If indeed the intent of the one sounding the shofar is required, how does the passerby fulfill his obligation?
Right. So Rabbi Zera's point in lines 29 and 1 was basically, I'm going to direct my servant to blow the shofar, and therefore everybody's fulfilled their obligation. Chick-chock my hair, we're done. Everything's good, right? And the Gemara, the unnamed voice of the Gemara, will raise an objection using the Mishnah that we learned, like, I don't know, at this point, it was like 2 months ago, right? And the objection from our Mishnah was, if a person is passing behind a synagogue and they hear the sound of the shofar, im kiven libo yatsa, if they incline their heart, right? If they were interpreting that as if they have kavana, then they've discharged their obligation, right? I'm walking past the synagogue on Purim, and I hear someone recite the scroll of Esther, and I listen in, I'm going, oh, they're reading the book of Esther. I'm listening now. I fulfilled my obligation for hearing the scroll of Esther. And I don't know whether the person inside isn't just mumbling this thing out loud without intent, right? I don't know whether the person inside who's blowing the shofar isn't just doing the Rabbi Goodman's trying to get a good sound and a good seal with his mouth on Rosh Hashanah, thinking that, you know, it's 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm practicing for the 9 a.m. service that I'm leading, right? So let's say someone's walking past the synagogue at 6 a.m. They hear me blowing. I don't have intent to fulfill anyone's mitzvah. I'm just practicing. They have intent. They discharge their obligation. This is a problem for Rabbi Zera because the blower doesn't have intent. The hearer does. And the Mishnah, an authoritative source, says they've fulfilled their obligation. This is pretty close to, as when you get it in the Talmud, as clean, as clear, as concise an argument, and as big a knockout punch as you will ever get, right? We don't get knockout punches in the Talmud. We usually get arguments that go on forever and then finish unresolved. This is a really good argument. Let's see how it concludes. Any questions up till here? Use the raise hand button or actually raise your physical hand, and I'll actually scroll around. Rich, you good? Rich is good. Noreen raised her hand, but it might be for the cat. It's probably for the cat. All right, we'll keep going.
It was because I sneezed.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you.
You can't hear someone sneeze.
I was on mute, so you couldn't hear me.
You can't hear someone sneeze on mute. It's like in space, no one can hear you scream.
Yeah.
On Zoom, no one can hear you sneeze. All right. Renee, you're up. You're going to do 3 for us. And we are really close to the end of the parak, in case you're wondering. Okay. Hacha b'shaliach tzibor askinan dedate akule alma. Akuli alma.
The Gemara answers, here we are dealing with a representative of the community, i.e., one who sounds the shofar for the entire congregation and has everyone in mind. He does not sound it for a specific individual, but rather on behalf of the entire community. And therefore, anyone who hears him sound the shofar fulfills his obligation.
So it's not a knockout punch. And the reason it's not a knockout punch is the rabbis have done what I refer to, or we refer to in Talmud. I think this qualifies. Some people are really strict with whether certain terms in Gemara actually apply, with what's called an okimta. An okimta is a limiting set of circumstances, right? And this okimta here is, here we are dealing with hacha. In this case, we're dealing with a case where a shaliach tzibor has been sent before that. So the phrase that they pivot on here is in the concept of going back a line, haya over achorei beit haknesset, right? If you're passing behind a beit knesset, a synagogue, and you hear the shofar, it would be a reasonable assumption to assume that the person blowing shofar or reading Megillah is the official designate of the synagogue. They're not passing behind my house where I might reasonably be assumed to be blowing shofar for practice. They're passing behind a synagogue where it must be assumed that whoever is in a synagogue blowing shofar is the shaliach tzibor. And once you are shaliach tzibor, the assumption is you have everyone in mind, meaning you have kavana, right? So there's a presumption, and I think this is really interesting. There's a presumption that the blower has kavana in this case, and therefore the hearer, who we interpret from the Mishnah, having im kiven libo, having kavana, we now are assuming that both the blower and the hearer have inclined their heart. They have kavana. And so Rabbi Zera's position still stands, not a knockout punch. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I always thought, like, say, someone who was the reader, the shliach tzibur, was praying on his or her behalf and on the congregation in the enclosure where that reader is.
Right.
I never thought, like, whenever I was a cantor, or a reader, I never thought that I was also going to fulfill the obligation of anyone who passes by and happens to hear me as a passerby. I mean, is that a logical conclusion, or? Because in other words, the whole business of shliach tzibur, in other words, tzibur is the community, is the entire community, all of Pittsburgh or all of Beersheba.
Right. I mean, so in the Zoom world, this has become a really interesting challenge. The case that I like the most about this is back in Brachot, which is related to this one, but it's the question of whether a person passing behind a synagogue who says amen to a blessing, or a person who is in the vestibule of the synagogue and can hear the service, but can't see the service, can discharge their obligation. And conversely, whether a person in the vestibule of the synagogue who can hear the service, but I, the shaliach tzibor, cannot see them, whether they can count for a minyan, right? And that issue gets into the Heller tshuva on Zoom services, in which Rabbi Adelson here in Pittsburgh is very punctilious. He's very strict. For those of you who are minyan people, you all know, Paula knows where this is going, is that you must turn on your camera to count. If you don't turn on your camera, you can't count. Now in Erie, I don't hold that way for at least two reasons. One is somewhat related to what we saw above, which is that a person who passes by the synagogue to hear can be, and is out, and the same in Brachot, a person who is out the window and is out on the street and you can see through the window can be counted. So like that's a case where I can't necessarily see their face, but I can see from the black screen and the fact that it says Paula Egger underneath that Paula is on the stream. And therefore I can count them for a minyan. Realistically, because I'm the rabbi in Erie, Pennsylvania, and we've been struggling to make a minyan literally since I started there 3 years ago, I will count anybody for anything. I jokingly say to my congregants and to people in this thing that I sometimes, since I'm on the Zoom and I'm in the room, I will count myself once in the room and I will count myself on Zoom. So I'm 2 people. And if I'm really struggling, I will take out my cell phone and log in on another camera because that'll give me 3 people. That's a joke. I don't actually do that. But there are times when, you know, I'm pretty sure that Paula, whose husband's name is Rob, who's a doctor, is there on Saturday morning to hear her read Haftorah. I'm assuming he's just in another room, right? And sometimes I ask and sometimes I don't, right? So anyways, so sometimes because of Zoom, we play fast and loose with counting people. That's my long-winded explanation for how like convoluted this can get. Marian, ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I know of synagogues, especially during the high holidays, where they open the vestibule and have the service through a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
So that begs the same kind of question.
Yeah. Before the pandemic, before Zoom services in the conservative movement, this was not a question, right? In the sense that there was a ruling going all the way back to the mid-90s in the conservative movement here in the United States, which said that if you need to make a minyan for a person in a hospital, what you do is they can log on to the minyan on their phone or through, you know, on a video screen. They did not have Zoom yet when this tshuva was written, and they can participate in minyan but not count. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of the rabbis in the conservative movement were trying to make sure that there were 10 people in the room for minyan and everybody else would be on Zoom, right? I always found that pretty weird, because to say, there's something weird for me to say you're participating in, and this is back to Mark's question, right? That you're participating in the service, or you are observing the service, but you're not part of the service. So there are also synagogues, and I have and we've talked about this in this group before. I have a colleague who she did in my synagogue in Denver, where I was before this. She streamed the service, so you could watch it on Facebook, but the only people in the Zoom were the service participants, and I knew because I was giving the sermon that week. So there were 10 people on the Zoom, and then there were another 50 people watching it elsewhere. I found that really strange, but there were many rabbis who did it that way. At the beginning of the pandemic, Zoom had all the Zoom bombing problems where anti-Semites would jump onto a live stream and ruin the service. We had one incident here at Beth Shalom. And the experience for some rabbis was, well, we're gonna restrict our Zoom down to people we know. So, all right, let's keep going. Mark, I'm gonna make you read because you have not, you have your microphone open anyways. So we're on 4, Tashma, and this is really a good big chunk conclusion. I think there's 2 more paragraphs. So Mark, you get the penultimate paragraph of this entire parak of Talmud. And it's going to get pretty close to answering our question. And it goes all the way back to actually a logical proof that Paula made, I think 2 classes ago, where she kind of jumped the shark. She knew what was coming way ahead. Okay, Tashma, nitkaven shomea, velo nitkaven mashmia, nitkaven mashmia, velo nitkaven shomea, lo yatsa, ad sheyitkaven shomea u mashmia, katani mashme dumya de shomea, ma shomea, shomea la'atzmo, af mashmia, mashmia la'atzmo, v'katani lo yatsa. All right, you're up, Mark.
The Gemara raises another objection. Come and hear that which was taught in a Braita. If the hearer of the shofar had intent, but the sounder of the shofar did not have intent, or if the sounder of the shofar had intent, but the hearer did not have intent, he has not fulfilled his obligation until both the hearer and the sounder have intent. The Braita teaches the halacha governing the sounder of the shofar in a similar fashion to the halacha governing the hearer. From this, it may be inferred that just as the hearer hears for himself, having intent to fulfill his own obligation, so too the sounder sounds for himself, having intent to fulfill his own obligation and not that of others. And the Braita teaches that if the sounder did not have this intent, the hearer has not fulfilled his obligation. But this indicates that if the sounder had intent to sound the shofar for himself, he need not have intent to sound it for others, therefore contradicting Rabbi, could you lower the Zera's opinion? Thank you.
So well done. So this is an interesting piece because what it starts off, hang on, Noreen, let me just review it and then we'll do it. So it starts off by seeming to go in the direction of Rabbi Zera, right? The Gemara raises an objection and it does it from a baraita. So a tashma is just like a meitveh. You're bringing a piece of text that we already know that throws it up against it, right? And the piece that we know that it's using again is nitkaven shomea velo nitkaven mashmiya, nitkaven mashmiya velo nitkaven shomea, lo yatsa, right? The blower and the hearer both need to have intent, okay? So that seems to, on the face, agree with Rabbi Zera, who says everybody's got to have intent. If anybody doesn't have intent, if someone's spaced out, not paying attention, or they're blowing a shofar or hearing a shofar just because they want to play a musical instrument or get some practice out of it, right? Then no dice, right? We have not fulfilled the obligation. But then the Talmud pivots and the Gemara will spin it in a different way with katani mashme dumya deshomya. So the Baraita teaches the halacha governing the sounder in similar fashion to the hearer. Just as the hearer hears for himself, so too the sounder sounds for himself. The Baraita teaches that if the sounder did not have this intent, the hearer has not fulfilled their obligation. This indicates that if the sounder had intent to sound the shofar for themselves, they may not have the intent to sound it for others. So it's not entirely a repudiation of Rabbi Zera, but it basically says the minute the blower picks up the shofar and blows and says, I'm blowing shofar, and doesn't say, I'm playing the cello, right? I don't know why they'd say that, but you know what I mean. But once they have intent and they know what they're doing, whether they have other people in mind does not matter. We brought this up last week and the week before regarding the question of hamotzi, which is really interesting, right? And this is why I'm trying to get better at the dining room table with my children of saying brachot out loud. I am not the world's greatest parent / rabbi because I really want to encourage them to understand that doing mitzvot and saying blessings is a part of the normative world. It's not that weird. So I'll say Borei minei mezonot over my food, and everyone at the table will look at me and be like, all right, dude, whatever, right? Because I have a 9 and 11-year-old, and they go to Jewish day school, so they think their rabbi father is embarrassing. So what that means is I am saying the thing out loud. I have them in mind, but even if I don't have them in mind, it does not matter. If they say amen, and then they dig into their pancakes, they're fine, right? Whether I say a blessing with other people in mind does not matter. If I'm in the social hall at synagogue and I say, Hamotzi lecha min haaretz, 8 other people at the table hear me, and they say, amen, and they grab a piece of bread and they eat it, I can't interrupt Marion and say, Marion, I didn't have you in mind. I was just saying hamotzi for myself. You can't say amen to my blessing. I'm gonna snatch that back, right? You can't have that amen and you can't have that piece of bread, right? It doesn't work that way, which is logical, right? The minute you utter a blessing, the minute you do an action, another person who sees you publicly do it assumes you have them in mind, and therefore they fulfill their obligation by doing it. Okay, Noreen, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, somebody is going out for a walk. He's out for a walk, not intending to go to service in the synagogue. But as he nears the synagogue, he suddenly hears the shofar, and he stops and says, "Oh, that's wonderful! I can hear the shofar." Now, how does that work? Because it wasn't his intention to hear the shofar.
Right. The implication here is Rabbi Zera says he did not fulfill his obligation, and the Gemara says he did. And that's a thing that we can do, by the way, which is we can, and you all know that it's just been a while since we had this. It's more or less a difference of opinion right now, which is that not everybody agrees that this is going to fulfill. When we read the last paragraph, I am going to read the halacha here because I think it's interesting to see what our rabbis ultimately do, because this is actually a pivotal question in Jewish practice, which is who's got to do things? Can other people do things for me and fulfill my obligation? Because there's a communalness to the shaliach tzibur, or an individual doing a blessing or saying a thing or blowing a shofar, right? Because the flip side is you could potentially go to an extreme here, which is to say, the only way I know that the person had me in mind with shofar is if it's me. And therefore, all of our synagogues should obligate someone to have their own shofar and blow it in synagogue, right? Everyone must have their own shofar, right? Marion, you're furrowing your brow. We already have a mitzvah like this, which is lulav and etrog. You cannot go to synagogue and watch someone else do lulav and etrog and say, have me in mind. It doesn't work. You have to pick it up, right? It's a mitzvah you have to do. Now, of course, the mitzvah is not in blowing shofar, it is in hearing shofar. But the logic is, if we ultimately went with the idea that only the blower can truly have intent, then we might ultimately reach the conclusion, everybody blow. Go ahead, Paula.
It's on subject and off. Suppose I'm not in the mood to go to services tonight on Zoom, but I feel obligated to be there only because I'm worried about them not having a minyan. I go on Zoom, I open up my face so it's there, but I'm doing something else at the same time, and my intent really isn't to pay attention and pray. Have I done my mitzvah to be the 10th person, or have I not?
Right. So this is my example of when I was at the day school in San Francisco and at the day school in Denver, that in both cases, we had a science teacher who was Jewish and did not believe in prayer or God or mitzvot. And when we had 9 people at morning minyan, we would grab Zeke Kossover or, who's the other guy? I forget the one in Denver. And we would drag them in, and they would bring their science papers, and they would grade the tests while they sat in the class, and we would count them. And the rule is they absolutely count. The only rule halachically, and I don't remember where this comes from, is you have to have 6 people actively participating and no more than 4 people who don't count. And Paula, back to your point above, if you remember back a couple pages, we dealt with the case of the Kohen, the priest who is duchening, and the question being, can your Kohen duchen if they've already duchen somewhere else, right? And the answer is yes, right? They can do that. So,
but it's not the same thing.
Why not?
Duchening a second time is not the same thing as having your face on Zoom to be a 10th person and not paying attention at all.
True. Because you're having an intent, but you could the analogy
The intent is to make sure we have the minyan, but the intent is not to really want to be in the mood to pray that time.
The reason that I draw the analogy is that the Kohen who duchens in the morning at one synagogue says, I am duchening for me and for everybody else. The second time when they're dragged in from Yoel Solomon to from after walking by from Yoel Solomon to Rivlin Street, is that that second time when they're dragged in, it would be hard for them to argue that they're doing it for themselves because they've already fulfilled their obligation. You can't discharge an obligation twice. Therefore, the second time, they're not doing it for themselves, which is why it's analogous to your case, which is you're logging onto Zoom, not because you want to discharge your obligation, because you want to discharge somebody else's, right? By the way, Paula, only you get to know this because you're the only Sunday night minyan person. Oh no, Dee sometimes is a Sunday night minyan person, which is I mostly log on to Sunday night minyan for the same reasons that you do, Paula. I am neither saying Kaddish, nor am I leading. So I'm just there to be 10, really, and to make sure.
Actually, that's not why I do Sunday night. I love to listen to Nancy, but that's another
good.
issue. I do that for you too. I like to listen to you too. If I know you're doing it, I'm there.
Right.
And I also find if I do that, I end up in my head, I'm participating and I'm not even thinking about it.
Right.
And all of a sudden I hear it's time for the Shema and I'm already going, right. It's automatic.
Right. Which honestly gets really at for me, the main philosophical piece of this whole kavanah problem, which is like, all right, I'm logging on because I want to make sure I make 10. And then suddenly I'm doing Hashkivenu and I'm like really shuckling, right? Like I never know when the bug is going to hit me. I don't know. Like tefillah is really interesting as a concept. Shofar too, where I don't know how I'm going to feel when I do the thing. So I do the thing a lot. And I was just thinking about this yesterday when I was, and it relates back to my time in Jerusalem, which is when I was a young man, when I was junior year abroad in Israel, and I bought myself an art scroll sitter and my own set of tefillin, and I davened on my own, and I did the prayers really slowly, and I was learning them, I would have moments of like sublime transcendence, right? I would feel very, very connected. Now, granted, I'm standing on Mount Scopus. I'm 20 years old, and I'm praying truly for the first time. So of course I'm having a unique experience. Now I'm 45 and I've been doing this for 25 years. And I am just as often doing it half asleep in frog pajamas and not fully awake of what I'm doing as I am having a transcendent moment where the light hits me and I feel like, oh, right? Like it doesn't happen like that as much anymore. But you do it just in case you get struck by the thunderbolt sometimes. So you hope anyways. And sometimes you do it just because you're mumbling through, and that's okay. All right, we're going to do one more chunk. It's our last chunk. Rich, do you mind reading this? It's 5. You get to be the final piece. I'm going to do the Aramaic, you'll do the Hebrew. It's a big deal. Tanai, by the way, it's only the end of a parak. It's not the end of it's not the end of the sugya. It's not the end of the parak. So the end of the parak, I warned you all, is very soon. It's like in 2 pages. It'll probably happen shortly after I get back from my vacation. So, but we'll prep it. But right now I can't quite figure out when it's going to happen. Tanai hi ditanya shomea la'atzmo umashmia lefi darko. Amar Rabbi Yossi b'mai devarim omrim bishliach tzibor aval b'yachid lo yatsa ad sheyitkaven shomea umashmia. Go ahead, Rich.
Yes. The Gemara answers, this is the subject of a dispute between Ta'anaim, as it is taught in a Baraita. The hearer hears for themselves, and the sounder sounds the shofar in their usual way, i.e., one does not intend to sound it for the sake of the hearer. Rabbi Yossi said, in what case is this statement said? It is said in the case of a representative of the community. But in the case of an ordinary individual, the hearer does not fulfill their obligation until both the hearer and the sounder have intent to discharge the hearer's obligation, as argued by Rabbi Zeira.
Okay, so it seems like they've somewhat split the difference here, which is ultimately they decide that when a person goes up on the dais at the synagogue, on the bima, and they're blowing shofar, and it's fairly clear or it's openly acknowledged that this person is the shliach tzibor, then de facto they discharge the obligation for anybody. However, if Rabbi Goodman is in his house and he's blowing shofar to practice, and he's just kind of blowing, if my wife comes down the stairs and says, hey, I got to go into work today on second day Rosh Hashanah, my wife pretty much works on second day Yom Tovs, even Rosh Hashanah, which isn't like, doesn't have the permissiveness usually in the conservative movement because she is a medical professional. Hey, I'm coming downstairs. I see you practicing with your shofar. I know you're going off to lead in Erie for a minute. Can you have me in mind right now? And I'll say yes. And then I blow. Then I fulfilled her obligation. But until we have a verbal conversation in which I, a yachid, acknowledge that I am fulfilling somebody else's obligation, then I cannot fulfill her obligation. This is, by the way, about as clean a finish as you get in a parak that I'll ever see, or not a parak, a Mishnah. We've entered a sugya. This section actually kind of ends in a fairly nice, harmonizing way with this baraita that kind of basically harmonizes the disagreement between the Gemara and Rabbi Zeira. Okay, I'm going to read this little piece from the halacha, and then we're going to go into a Mishnah and move on. And the moving on is, because it's Talmud, we never really move on. It's more or less on the same subject. So don't get antsy. He's like, Rabbi Goodman, you're moving too fast for us. Don't worry. We're coming back to the same point over and over and over again until we move on to the 4th parak, which will actually mostly look like the 3rd parak all over again. Okay, so the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim, section, I have to do my halachic math, 5, Samach Ayin Pei Tzadi Kuf, 589, halachas 8 and 9 say the following: Hotokea b'shofar over yachid. The person who blows shofar, but is doing so as an individual, as opposed to a shliach tzibor, tzarich yikaven lohotzio yadei chovato, needs to have kavana in order to discharge their own obligation. Okay, so you can't pick up a shofar and just blow it and fulfill the obligation. You have to have kavana when you blow the shofar. Now, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't clarify exactly what that says, what that means, but it's okay. V'shaliach tzibor hatokea over hatzibor, the representative of the community who blows on behalf of the community, eno omrim shehu mitkaven lahotzi kol misha yishma et tikiyato. Right. The shaliach tzibor doesn't have to say anything. He just basically de facto is the person we assume that is discharging their obligation. And kol misha yishma et tikiyato. Lohotzi kol misha yoshmia et tikiyato. So everybody who hears a shaliach tzibor blow shofar has fulfilled their obligation, right? Rich and Noreen are having a conversation in the back of my synagogue at Erie. They're not really paying attention. I'm blowing shofar up front, and I'm the shaliach tzibor. I didn't say, I'm the shaliach tzibor. I have kavanah for all of you. Rich and Noreen are fine. As long as they hear the shofar, and I had kavanah, they've discharged their obligation. Even if they really didn't stop in their conversation to stop and listen, I've still fulfilled their obligation. They have to stop talking for a second, but at least if they heard even a shtickle of it, they're good to go. All right, it keeps going. Lefikach afilu haya mehalech baderech o yoshev bebeito, right? And even still, even if one is walking on their way or sitting in their house, right? If I blow shofar at my synagogue and Rich lives across the street, and he opens his window and he hears it, ushomea tekiya mishaliach tzibor, and they heard it from a shaliach tzibor, not from some random person. Im mitkaven latzeit yotzei yedei chavato. If Rich hears that and goes, "Oh, Rabbi Goodman's across the street; he's blowing shofar," I'll listen. Rich has fulfilled his obligation, even though he isn't sitting in the synagogue to start. That's the halacha. That's how the halacha comes down, which basically comes down with where we finished off, which is pretty interesting, right? I think it took them a long way to get there. That was a long walk for that payoff. Any questions before we move on to the next Mishnah? Good. We have 9 minutes to do this Mishnah, and it's a really interesting one. It'll lead into the Gemara, which deals with some transgender issues, which we may or may not have time to start with, but we will definitely start with next week, if not, okay? With that, Noreen, have you read? You read, right? You did not read. Why don't you start us off? I'll read the Mishnah, and you'll read the text. Okay, this is an interesting place to start if you're really a nerd for how Talmud deals with biblical verses. Sometimes in person, but back in the Jeremy Marquise days here in Pittsburgh, we would lean in here. I don't think we're going to lean in here. We would stop and we would open the Tanakh and we would slow down and whatever. I kind of want to get to the next chunk. We may lean in next week if I decide to. So you can tell me at the end of class whether you think we ought to spend some time here or whether we should just keep moving because we're close to the end. Again, it's theoretical whether you think we should cover pages, breakneck speed like a Daf Yomi class, or whether we should mull over things with our coffee and think deeply about the bigger thoughts in the world. All right. Matnitin, our Mishnah. V'haya ka'asher yarim Moshe yado v'gavar Yisrael v'gomre. V'chi yadav shel Moshe osot milchama o shovrot milchama. Ele lomar lach. Kol zman shehayu Yisrael mistaklin klapei mala umisha'abdin et libam la'avihem shebashamayim hayu mitgavrim ve'im lav hayu noflim. All right, you're up, Noreen.
Mishnah. Incidental to the discussion of the required intent when sounding the shofar, the Mishnah cites the verse, "And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed." It may be asked, did the hand of Moses make war when he raised them, or break war when he lowered them? Rather, the verse comes to tell you that as long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell.
Okay. So this is really interesting. And it's a weird pivot because it's really by the by. It's related to the question of intent, but it's actually a pretty big jump in a different direction. And it's a thing that the rabbis will do on occasion with Torah, which is this whole debate about intent. It reminds me of a verse in the Torah that I've never spent any time breaking down. Let me break it down. And then Renee, once I explain this, I'll call on Renee. There's this story in the Torah, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. It's right after they've crossed the Red Sea. And this wandering bandit Bedouin tribe that's in the Sinai called Amalek comes up and starts attacking them. And the Israelites are kind of bedraggled. And so they go to war with Amalek. And Moses stands on top of a cliff. And according to tradition, when Moses lifts his arms, the war goes well. When Moses lowers his arms, they start to lose the battle. So the question that rabbis are asking is, what's happening here? Which is really interesting. Does Moses have magic powers that when Moses' arms are up, the war goes well? And when Moses' arms are down, the war doesn't go well? Is this actual magic that Moses is doing? Or is it, as I wrote when I studied this the first time through with Rabbi Marquise a couple of years ago, is this what I refer to as Dumbo's magic feather, right? Remember the crows in the movie Dumbo give Dumbo a feather because he's got these giant ears, and they say, this is a magic feather and allow you to fly. And then at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, he loses the magic feather. And guess what? He can fly anyways, right? Are Moses' arms being raised? Are they actual magic? Or is this just that the people look up at Moses and go, Moses has his magic arms up, we're going to win. And when Moses puts his arms down, they go, oh no, we can't win the fight. We don't have Moses' magic arms. By the way, the story ends in the Torah, you probably remember this, with Moses and Aaron and Hur, his brother and his brother-in-law, standing next to him and propping his arms up so that they don't go down, right? And so, but the question that's being asked here is, what's happening here? Does this really work? The answer that the Talmud sort of cryptically gives is, as long as they're mesha'abdin et libam la'avihem shebashamayim, as long as their hearts are serving our Father in heaven, our parent in heaven, they prevailed, which implies that they have intent because of Dumbo's magic feather, right? That they were encouraged by Moses' arms to believe in God. When Moses' arms came down, it was Dumbo's magic feather, that they did not believe anymore, which is really interesting, right? Okay, Renee, go ahead and ask your question. And then Marion.
Well, I guess you answered it to some extent, but it's a question of whatever Moses' intent was,
right.
It didn't matter. It was the people's intent and the fact that the Jewish people needed to keep God in their hearts. And so when they didn't, that's when they fell.
Right.
So it sort of says that it doesn't make any difference what the intent of the giver, the shofar blower is. It has to do with the intent of the person listening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you are really smart, and you're really you're trying to keep it in line with the topic that has been at hand, which is legit because it's where they're going. I'm a little bit more frou-frou and like all over the place, also because I know how the rabbis do things. The end of every parak in Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara, and when you do enough Talmud, you'll see this, is kind of this random grab bag of stuff. The rabbis, this is basically like hanging out with my dad, which is he'll go, that reminds me of a story. And he'll tell a story. And we'll turn to my father at the end of the story and we'll be like, Dad, what did that have to do with anything? He goes, oh, remember? And we'll be like, that was pretty tangential. I didn't pick up the thread there, Pops. I didn't see that. But, never stop my father from telling a good story. He says the guy who just told the story about being in yeshiva that went on for hours and hours. So, but that's the ends of prakim are often like this. The rabbis are just doing rabbinic story time. It's like, that reminds me of the story. Part of this, and this is important to know as the reader of this kind of text, is, and the scholars debate this hotly, is about the construction of the Talmud, right? The Talmud was not a book that was written from beginning to end by one author who did a really great job of editing. The Talmud is a massive, huge, you can see it behind me. You can see some of it behind me. There it is on 2 shelves in my living room, right? It's a massive collection of thousands of scraps of rabbinic stories. And part of the problem becomes, how do I weave these all together? Where do I throw this chunk, right? And so it is entirely possible, no offense, Renee, not to discredit your logical threading, which was on point and probably exactly what they wanted. It could be entirely possible that the rabbis were like, hey, we did this breakdown of the thing about Moses's arms, and it doesn't fit anywhere in the Talmud. Let's just throw it in at the end of Parak 3 about intent, because it's sort of related. You know what I mean? Mark's laughing because he gets it. But like, when you do a lot of Talmud, you sometimes hit on points where you're like, that's related, but not really, but I guess. So anyways, but it's interesting. It's like Renee's really like locked in. It's like, oh, this is totally on point. And I'm like, maybe, all right, Marion, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to refer that it follows through the whole book of Judges. The stories are that when the Israelites turn to God and do the mitzvot and they're good, then they're fine. But as soon as they turn away, their enemies defeat them and they're in terrible shape,
right,
until they turn to God again. And this repeats and repeats and repeats.
Right. And it's interesting because the rabbis are making a move that's very Deuteronomistic, which is faith in the one God, the Yud He Vav He, the Elohim God, is the whole point of Judaism. And when you turn away from that, you're doing bad things. This is interesting because the rabbis are interpreting something in that vein, Marion, but the pshat of the text, the simple meaning of the text, doesn't say that, right? It says, Dumbo's magic feather, right? It's like Moses had magical powers. And that's also this running fight, both between the rabbis and within the Torah itself, is like, the Torah seems to imply that everything that Moses did was only through God, right? Only that God chose Moses, but all the magic powers are God's and God's alone. The staff doesn't have magic powers. Moses doesn't call the plagues. It's all God. But you could argue that point. It's not a given, right? You could make an argument that Moses has free will and magic powers because Moses does some cool stuff. And we don't always get a very clear thing that says, like it doesn't say Moses threw his staff and God turned it into a snake. Moses threw the staff and it turned into a snake. That might have been Moses, right? You might be able to make an argument that the Torah's pshat argument is Moses had magic powers, okay? The rabbis would never say that because magic is expressly forbidden in Judaism. But I would make the argument that that possibility exists within the text. The rabbis want to spin it in a spiritual way. Let's do this last piece to finish almost finish the Mishnah, and then we'll get to the stuff about various categories of individuals who may or may not fulfill the obligation of hearing shofar, including transgendered individuals next week. It's an interesting one. With that, I'm going to have, who's left who hasn't read? I think everybody's read, except for Olivia, whose camera's off, so I never like to call on Olivia. Marion, you want to read one more time? unless Olivia wants to.
I can read.
Okay,
I can read.
okay, Olivia, you're going to read. We're doing verse 7. I'll do the Hebrew, you do the English. It's another section, and then we'll call it a day. כיוצא בדברים אתה אומר, עשה לך שרף ושים אותו על נס, והיה כל הנשוך וראה אותו וחי. וכי נחש ממית או נחש מחיה? אלא בזמן שישראל מסתכלים כלפי מעלה ומשעבדים את ליבם אביהם שבשמיים, היו מתרפים, ואם לאו, היו נימוקים. Go ahead, Olivia.
Similarly, you can say, the verse says, make for yourself a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. Numbers 21:8. Once again, it may be asked, did the serpent kill, or did the serpent preserve life? Rather, when the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they rotted from their snake bites.
Great. The reason I wanted to finish with this was at least because you probably wouldn't start a week from now remembering what the whole logic was here. But once you've done the text above, this text is the same, basically, which is to say, the rabbis are bringing another piece of text which has theological implications, which they did not like, right? Which is Moses's magical snake, right? So the people all get bit by snakes in this story that almost every rabbi skips over in the Torah because there's better stuff in that parsha to look at. The people all get bit by snakes and they're gonna die. And God says, make this golden serpent, put her on a pole, and when everybody looks at the serpent, they'll be healed. And the theological question the rabbis are asking here is, wait, hold up. We just made a golden idol and told the people to stare at it and it would save their lives. Isn't that theologically problematic? Don't we have a whole bunch of stuff in Numbers that literally says, and literally like the first commandment, do not make for yourself a graven image? You know, like, isn't this full-blown idolatry? You are praying to this serpent and this serpent is healing you. This is really problematic, right? And the answer that they get is the same one as above, which is no. The golden serpent is nothing. It's another Dumbo's magic feather, right? It makes people think that they are going to be healed from the serpent bite. But what they're really doing is by looking at the snake, they're inclining their hearts towards their matriarch in heaven. And the Holy One, blessed be God, is healing them for their faith in the snake, which is pretty weird. By the way, Richard Elliott Friedman, in his eminent work, Who Wrote the Bible, has a really good explanation of this section. It has a lot to do with the combat and the disagreement between the northern tribes and the southern tribes, who had different symbols as to what their central symbol was. I think the northern tribe symbol is a calf, and the southern tribe symbol was a serpent. And so it has to do with the battle between the north and the south in Israel in the time period at which the Bible would have been written, if you are a believer in biblical criticism. That's all the time we have for today. In fact, I'm 6
Wanted to
oh, go ahead.
I popped something in the chat just because these snakes get no attention, but at Shavuot, there's a Sephardi tradition of making a special challah called the bread of the seven heavens. Is 7 rings of dough, and then 4 symbols around them for Shavuot. One of them being Jacob's ladder, another one being Miriam's well, and then the snake specifically from that scene, and not any other scene.
Wow!
And you can check it out there. I put the link. And I made one of these last Shavuot, and it was a really good time.
Wow, that's wild. I did not know about that. That's super cool. It's really interesting, and also like I've never really done a whole lot of deep diving into the use of snakes in biblical imagery, but it shows up a lot. You know, it's here all over the place. So it's really interesting. I'm going to read that. I'm going to click it and make sure it pops open in another screen before I go, which you should all do too. You can click that any link and it'll pop open and it won't won't break things. Olivia found a snake emoji. Good job. All right, if anybody has anything else to say, otherwise we will stop recording.